So my name is Matt Andrews. We're here in Newport Beach in sunny Southern California, and we're here today to talk about watches and things that interest me. Today I'm wearing my Sea Dweller. So this is the second one that I've had. This is a Triple Six, so it's a transitional piece that has a glass crystal, which is different than my previous one that was a great white that was arguably, as a Mark I, a more coveted watch. But I think as we talk today, I think you'll see I like things that are a little different from others, as well as different from the other things that I have, and this is a piece that really stood out. So I chose this Triple Six over the 1665 for a couple of reasons. If you look at any purchase in a vacuum or any acquisition in a vacuum, you may come up with a different result than if you really look at the context of the rest of a collection or where it is you are in life or what a piece means to you. And this Triple Six is different than the other pieces that I have. So all other vintage Rolexes I have are in acrylic glass, and this Triple Six is a transitional piece. It's a really beautiful face, and it's got a really cool insert. Well, arguably, my Mark I did as well. But this is uniquely different because it is a crossover to a more modern piece, and it's something that I didn't have. It's interesting, when you talk about modern watches, I'm not really attracted to the new things that are available in a boutique. The most modern watch I have is about a 20-year-old titanium Panerai that I bought right after getting married in where was I? I think I was on Grand Cayman. So interestingly, I bought this right before their acquisition, so it's a previous generation watch, and I bought it before people really knew what Panerais were and before every Wall Street guy was looking for a big 44 millimeter watch. So it's special to me. I like it. I'm wearing it in the pictures when my first son was born, so this will be a watch that he gets at some point in life. But it's not something that lots of other collectors beat down my door to take a look at, but it's special to me. I like finding things that are off the beaten path and making purchases or having things that aren't what everybody else wants. I think we live in a society, or especially in a community here in Newport Beach, where money can buy you anything, but it can't buy you taste, and it can't buy you differentiation and knowledge about how you're different than the guy who's wearing a Batman or a Hulk or a Patek or whatever that may be. And so I enjoy having pieces that are nice, but that people appreciate if they know whatever it is you're into, as opposed to the flashy car or the newest watch that everybody's got a 1 or 2 year wait for. I mean, I like things that are a little more subtle because I interact with people in all different walks of life, and I don't like walking into a room being the guy with all the blinging belt, shoes, buckles, whatever. And this is a good way to do that. I fell into vintage watches really through friends, and I think that's what I enjoy most about the watches that I have is actually really the learning about vintage Rolexes, where they've been, or what makes watches do certain things, and why they're special to other people. And those relationships, I think, have really got me interested in other things. When you think about vintage Rolexes and the fact that you have multiple different watches for different purposes, I find that interesting. The reality is that I'm a pretty boring guy at this stage of life where I'm focused on raising kids, being at home, progressing in my career. I love the different watches, be it a GMT, a Sea Dweller, whatever that might be, because they look different, they feel different, there's a tactile difference. And while I recognize that a Sea Dweller was meant to go diving at super deep depths, candidly, I've been a scuba diver. I would never go scuba diving with my sweet Sea Dweller now. And that's a little bit of a shame. You could say that with some of cars that I've owned that are meant to be on a racetrack and driven at 10 tenths. And maybe you wouldn't do that now because they're better tools for that. But that's what they were used for then. If I think about the Sea Dweller, this is different than the other watches I have because it's got a heft to it. When I swing my hand, you can actually feel the movement self-winding itself. And it just has a very different feel. I don't have to look at the watch to recognize what piece I'm wearing, and I really enjoy that. So this 1675 was the first vintage Rolex that I acquired. And I was really attracted to it, candidly, because of the color. The insert has a great fuchsia color, which I think was sought after when I acquired this watch a good number of years ago. but I didn't really care about significance of what other people thought, and I'm not trying to be the pretentious guy who says I buy what it is I love and I don't care what anybody else thinks. I don't think anybody that says that is not 100% being truthful with themselves. But if I look at the insert and the blues, candidly, those are colors. I love color. If you look at cars that I've owned, clothing, whatever that would, I love the way color pops. And so the insert of this watch is actually probably more important to me than the actual watch itself. As I've been through a series of other watches, and I've considered, I'm not necessarily married to this GMT, but I am married to the bezel. And the bezel won't be leaving my home, even if the watch that it sits on changes. Curtis from Gray & Patina helped me find this watch. And as we were going through a series of different GMTs and things that at the time were considered entry level, I mean, this isn't really entry level anymore, but we went through a lot of different GMTs. Some that may have had cases that were in better condition or had better dials. But when we started looking at different watches, the ones that always stood out to me that were the ones with really bright and interesting storied inserts. And so we looked for quite a while, and Curtis, I know, showed me a lot of watches before we found this. And I actually remember that he showed it to me and then left with the watch because I wasn't convinced that I wanted to make the purchase. But this was the first watch that that I wouldn't stop talking to my wife about. It was the first piece that, candidly, I went back to. I was like, yeah, I can't find anything else like that, and I haven't been able to see one that I could readily get my hands on. And so that's when I knew that was the one. And so that became my first vintage Rolex, and it's supposed to be my first and only. So after I acquired this Mark I GMT, I was candidly satisfied with it being my only vintage Rolex for at least a year, maybe two. And then my next purchases happened really quickly. So I actually don't have the next two watches with me that I acquired. I quickly acquired a Submariner and a Sea Dweller, but both Mark I watches back to back, probably within 60 days of each other. They were great watches, and they filled out a collection as I started to learn more about watches and become a little bit more educated in the things that I appreciated. They became pieces that, while I liked, they were ready to move on to their next owner and then their next home. After this GMT, the next thing that is in my collection that I still have with me now was this Sea Dweller. And at that time, I had a Submariner and that GMT and a super domed Sea Dweller, but they were all relatively, they were similar. And this watch came to me actually with this insert that was darker. It was beautiful. And then I think about 2 weeks later, Curtis from Gray & Patina actually said, hey, he had a ghost bezel and would I like to see it? And I think I take a long time with a lot of my purchases, and he's been pretty patient with me, but this was probably about a 30-second purchase. I'd love the way it's worn, and the impact of the ghost bezel really brings out the rest of the dial and the size of the plots and the color of the plots and the lume. So then this 1680 came to me candidly when I was not looking for it. My watch collection was a series of Mark Is across whichever version of Rolex watch I was out there, and I really wasn't looking at the later generations. But this watch came to me because it was so striking in the visuals and the colors. And I think, as I've said earlier, that color is something that I love, and candidly I'm attracted to almost more so than any other component of functionality or heritage or whatever a watch may have. And this 1680 had the most gorgeous, almost blue, almost brown insert that was really offset by the color of the plots and the lume. And it's really, while I wasn't necessarily thinking that I wanted another cycloped watch, that when I got the call and said, hey, that this is a piece I might be interested in, I wouldn't say I looked at it begrudgingly, but I didn't think that I would be. But I realized that the color is incredible. And oddly, as a watch that is initially supposed to be all black, when you wear tans and browns, the colors really pop and almost look purple. So it seems like hobbies come in twos or threes. I guess I don't know if that's the way pets do or whatever do as well. But I have enjoyed vintage Rolexes as it also seems to travel in a similar community with the other things that I'm interested in. So long ago I raced cars semi-competitively, and while I don't do that anymore, my other real interest is cars. And so while I'm not spending time at a racetrack anymore, I've really taken to the things that hung on my bedroom wall when I was a kid. So I'm a kid and a product of the 90s, and the epitome of sports cars to me then were air-cooled Porsches. And I don't know why air-cooled Porsches and vintage Rolexes go hand in hand, but I think they do for a lot of people. And I don't know if it's an appreciation of craftsmanship and fit and finish and pedigree, and compare that to there may be watches that are lighter or better or whatever now, in the same way there are cars that are faster, but there is something to the way things were built, and for cars the way they smell, for watches the tactile feel, and then really the community that goes around them. I can drive a vintage Porsche to the grocery store, and people who don't know anything about them just think you're driving an old car. And the people who know have a real appreciation for it. I feel the same goes true for vintage watches at the same time. When you think what's happened with the broad appeal of vintage Rolexes or of vintage cars, and vintage is it's an interesting term. I wouldn't think that something from the 90s is vintage, but I guess I'm starting to show my age too. I think that it's cool that there's a broader audience and people are interested, and yeah, I mean, it does drive prices up. I don't spend a whole lot of time waxing off as to whether that's better to have things appreciate or whether I'd prefer things to continue to have stayed low and more accessible. I mean, the reality is that the watches that I've bought, I wish I hadn't sold because, well, now they would be worth more. Same could be said about the cars. I mean, the reality is that's the world we live in. And would I love to have everything that I'd acquired and have it at the price that I paid for whenever I bought it? Sure. But that's not the world we live in today. You know, it's interesting when you think about what the purpose is in, I mean, collecting is a weird word. I don't know that I would have said that I'm a watch collector. I have a couple watches because, believe me, you find somebody who has way more than you and they're like, you don't have a collection. Let me show you a collection. But my goal isn't to own everything. I do think there's a real challenge in releasing, right? If you think about things that you regret having sold before, be that cars, be that watches, be that a house or whatever. I mean, I think there's, in some ways, the emotional attachment to those items grows when you don't have it anymore. And I actually, it's been easier for me with cars to be able to release because, candidly, I've only got so much space. I'm not a person of infinite funds, and so in order to be able to move on to the next thing, you got to free up resources in order to be able to go after and find it. So if I think about previous watches and previous cars that I've owned, I mean, I've had previous Porsches and other cars, be them Japanese cars or other German cars or Italian cars, and that have led me to where I am now. And so I feel like I appreciate the items I have now more because of the things that came before them. In fact, if I think of my current 964 that I have, I would not have found it if it wasn't for the previous one that I had, and actually sold it thinking I was buying something different, having had that fall through. This one became available, and I mean, now fills a space in the garage in my heart, or whatever cheesy term you want to use. My current Porsche 964 is a 1992 Carrera Cup car. This is a special car to me because of my real interest in street Porsches is because of the racing heritage and the amount of time that I used to spend on track. This car is one of 45 that was brought to the US to start a German spec series here in the States. In '92, when they were brought over, Porsche was not able to find enough teams to sign up to buy the cars and to run the series, and it was stillborn. So they had brought 45 cars over that were seam-welded cars that had thin glass, that had the hot motors, that had the magnesium components. They essentially were a European RS that was prepped for race. Well, of those 45 cars, 30 of them were sent to Andile here in Southern California and converted into race cars. The series was then canceled, and those 30 cars were then converted and hacked back to stock. And there's still ways you can tell, if you can find one of them, where they've got components of the cage still in them. Mine is one of the other 15 that is a street car that was never converted into a race car. So it has the hot motor and short ratio gearbox and all those sorts of things, but is an unmolested street car. And so I found this 964 actually when another purchase fell through. I thought I was buying a European RS that didn't turn out to be exactly what it was advertised as, and so I went on the search again. And this car was initially owned by a surgeon in San Diego who kept every record, including the check that he used to purchase the car, a record of every time the car was filled with gas, and every receipt for the 20 years that he owned it. He then sold it to an individual in Idaho who had it for the last 8 years, put less than 1,000 miles on it, and literally didn't even have insurance on the car when I went to acquire it. And so I spent about 45 days talking to the guy about the car, and then finally flew up to see him. And at the end of our conversation, he looked at me and he goes, "Matt, I love this car, and now I love you too." And he gave me a huge hug, and at which point then I knew clearly I had a price, and it was a white Porsche. And I took it, put it on a trailer, and drove it home. When I'm asked for my opinion when other people are looking at purchasing cars, and the question of history and records, and well, it was owned by this person, and Magnus Walker owned this car or sat in it for an afternoon, therefore it's, I mean, I think those things can have some value. I think with vintage cars, and candidly watches too, understanding the current condition is really important. And if you've got the ability to vet through mechanicals and understand like what a current condition of a car or a watch is without having had a ton of records or without having had somebody tell you that this is a known piece, then great, then it'll be fine, and you'll develop your own records from then on out. If you can't do that, and you can't get over this under the skin of those things, and you're not prepared for surprises, then there's a lot more value in having something with provenance. So I do think it's neat to have a story about my white 964 that I know. I've actually talked to the original owner multiple times, and actually on more than one occasion I've bought parts from him because he's a old school Porsche guy who's been buying these cars since they were new. And I think that's special, but I think candidly the 964 I had before that was one that I found from a dentist in Utah who didn't really know what it was he had. He bought a Porsche when he graduated from and got his doctorate and thought that's what you're supposed to do. So it had absolutely zero history. And that's kind of a fun story to me too. And I think that what is cool about watch communities, car communities, anything where you invest a ton of time is I think that's where your friendships come from. And so the other car that I'm actually a steward of right now is a Irish green 1966 912. And my garage is the third garage on the street that car has lived in. So it was originally restored by a gentleman who lived around the corner, who has multiple air-cooled Porsches, and older gentleman who I hope to be as successful as at some point in life. And we had another neighbor who was a really good friend who was sure that he wanted to get into the vintage market. And I helped him look at a bunch of cars, and this is actually the one we settled on. So he bought it. And then a couple of weeks after he purchased the car, he got transferred to Switzerland for 3 years. And so the expense of taking this really nice car with him was too high, and he knew he was coming back. And so he really needed a place to store the car for a couple of years. And because these cars need to be driven in order to be upkept, I volunteered. So the car now lives in my garage until its owner comes back from Europe. And so we take it out all the time and treat it like it's ours, and just can't put the dog in it. So I think it is really fun to mess with people that are very period correct or very interested in the mechanics of what is right for right year, right watch, right car, right components. And it's really important to know those things. And I almost have more joy in, rather than showing somebody something that's absolutely the way it's supposed to be and having them check the boxes and say, well, yes, that's very good, Matt, to really actually kind of ruffle some feathers. Because I've enjoyed running different inserts, different bands on watches because I want to change it up. They're mine. And I really dig that. In the same way I look at cars. So my Cup car was supposed to have a certain series of or size wheels and color wheels and size brakes, and I've got all those things, but I really wanted a white Cup car with maritime blue brakes and white wheels, and damn it, that's what I got. Now, all the right parts are on the shelf, but I love rolling up to Cars and Coffee and having, you know, the guys with mustaches and help build these cars, race them back in the day, just very upset that I would do this to a car like that, and that's half the fun, right? I think it's interesting when you look at watches. I do have watches that other people are excited about, or there's a vintage community around. But really, to me, the most important things are what they mean to you. And so this Elgran pocket watch is from the early 1900s and actually belonged to my great-great-grandfather. And these are one of the first watches that came off of an assembly line, so they're not worth a lot. But there's a lot of family value to me, as this has been passed from my father to me and to him before that. And this is one of the few things that I have from my dad's side of the family, and so it's special. It's not something that turns heads, but when I open my watch box, it's something that makes me smile.